For more than 100 years, one of the strangest theories in the history of archaeology claimed that Chinese civilization did not actually begin in China. It claimed that the people who built the earliest dynasties along the Yellow River had actually migrated there from thousands of kilometers away, carrying their writing system, their bronze technology, and their entire civilization with them from somewhere else. The theory had a name, it had serious academic backers, and for decades it was taken seriously in scholarly circles around the world. And then genetics arrived and tore the entire theory apart, replacing it with something far stranger and, in a way, far more impressive than the original myth ever was. Here is exactly what scientists found when they finally tested where Chinese civilization actually came from, all the way down to the DNA. The theory in question is sometimes called Sino-Babylonianism, and it emerged in the late 19th century, proposed by a French linguist studying ancient Chinese characters. He noticed apparent similarities between early Chinese writing and the cuneiform script used in ancient Mesopotamia. And he built an entire historical narrative around that observation, arguing that a group of migrants from the region of ancient Elam, in what is now western Iran, had traveled overland across Central Asia and settled along the Yellow River sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE, bringing with them the foundations of what would eventually become Chinese civilization. For a period of time, this theory was genuinely influential, taught in some academic settings and treated as a serious possibility for explaining how something as sophisticated as early Chinese writing, bronze casting, and state organization appeared to emerge so quickly along the Yellow River. The theory eventually collapsed under the weight of its own evidence, well before modern genetics ever entered the picture. Archaeologists excavating sites across the Yellow River Valley throughout the 20th century uncovered an unbroken sequence of cultural development stretching back thousands of years before the supposed migration was even claimed to have happened. With pottery styles, settlement patterns, and early symbols evolving gradually and continuously within the region itself, rather than appearing suddenly and fully formed from outside. By the time archaeology had mapped out cultures like Yangshao and Longshan, predating the first historically documented Chinese dynasties by well over 1,000 years, the idea that Chinese civilization had been imported wholesale from Mesopotamia no longer had any serious archaeological support left to stand on. But archaeology alone could only tell part of the story, because pottery and tools can be copied, traded, or independently reinvented. What archaeology could not definitively settle was the question of the people themselves. Did the populations living along the Yellow River and Yangtze River thousands of years ago actually descend from groups that originated somewhere else entirely, even if their material culture developed locally? That question required something archaeology alone could never provide: the actual genetic record of the people who lived there, recovered directly from their bones. Over the past several years, researchers working with ancient DNA recovered from burial sites across China have been able to answer that question with a level of precision that simply was not possible a generation ago. And the picture that emerged is almost the exact opposite of what the old migration theory predicted. Rather than tracing back to populations from Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, or anywhere else outside East Asia, the ancient inhabitants of the Yellow River and Yangtze River regions show genetic continuity stretching back tens of thousands of years within East Asia itself, connecting directly to some of the earliest populations to settle the region after humans first arrived there during the initial migrations out of Africa. What researchers found instead, when they compared ancient genomes recovered from sites scattered across what is now China, was something genuinely fascinating. Two distinct, deeply rooted ancestral populations, each tied to a specific river system, each independently developing agriculture, hunting, and each eventually contributing, through thousands of years of gradual mixing, to the genetic makeup of the population we now call Han Chinese. Along the Yellow River in the north, ancient populations were cultivating millet as early as roughly 9,000 years ago, developing a distinct genetic and cultural lineage associated with some of the earliest organized farming communities in East Asia. Along the Yangtze River further south, a separate ancient population was independently cultivating rice during a similar time frame, developing its own distinct genetic lineage, one that, remarkably, is also closely connected to the deep ancestry of populations that would eventually become Austronesian seafarers. Tai-Kadai-speaking populations, and several other ethno-linguistic groups scattered today across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. These two ancestral lineages, the millet farming population of the Yellow River and the rice farming population of the Yangtze, did not stay completely separate. Over thousands of years, as populations expanded, traded, and intermarried across the region, the genetic boundary between the two lineages gradually blurred, producing the broad, blended genetic profile found across most of modern China today, with populations in the north carrying a higher proportion of the ancient Yellow River lineage, and populations in the south carrying a correspondingly higher proportion of the ancient Yangtze lineage, There is no genetic signature anywhere in this record pointing toward Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, or any other ancient civilization located thousands of kilometers to the west. The match, when researchers finally went looking for one, was not with some distant ancient civilization at all. It was with China's own deep indigenous prehistoric past. That finding alone would be a satisfying answer to a century-old academic debate. But it raises a separate and arguably more interesting question. If Chinese civilization developed independently, without significant outside genetic input from other ancient civilizations, how do you explain the genuine similarities that earlier scholars noticed between early Chinese writing and other ancient writing systems? The honest answer, supported by the broader history of writing systems around the world, is that early writing systems independently invented in completely unconnected civilizations tend to converge on certain similar features, not because of shared ancestry, but because of shared constraints. Early writing systems across the world, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, and in China, all began as systems for recording practical information. Counts of grain, ownership of goods, administrative records. Independently, in multiple unconnected regions, those early systems moved through similar developmental stages, from simple pictographic representations of objects toward more abstract, standardized symbols. Surface-level similarity between early writing systems turns out to be a predictable outcome of solving the same practical problem with the same basic tools, pictures, and abstraction, rather than evidence that one civilization borrowed its writing system from another, much less that one civilization's people physically migrated from the other's territory. This same pattern of independent invention, rather than shared origin, shows up again when you look closely at early Chinese bronze technology, another pillar of the old migration theory. Bronze metallurgy did appear comparatively late in the archaeological record of the Yellow River region, compared to some other parts of the ancient world, which is part of why earlier scholars assumed it must have been imported from somewhere with a longer bronze working tradition. But archaeological excavation has since traced a gradual locally developed sequence of metalworking technology within China itself, moving from early experiments with copper to increasingly sophisticated bronze alloys over a period of centuries, paralleling, rather than directly copying, similar gradual developments that occurred independently in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. Civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers with no significant evidence of direct contact both arrived at bronze metallurgy through a broadly similar trial and error process, because bronze metallurgy, once you understand the underlying chemistry, is a discovery available to any sufficiently organized society with access to copper and tin ore, regardless of geography or ancestry. There's a striking piece of supporting evidence here that comes from an entirely different field of study, and it lines up with the genetics almost perfectly. Now, linguists studying the deep history of language families across Asia have long noted that the Sino-Tibetan language family, which includes Mandarin and the other Chinese languages alongside Tibetan, Burmese, and dozens of related languages, appears to have spread outward from a homeland somewhere in the Yellow River region, based on patterns of vocabulary, grammar, and the geographic distribution of related languages today. Separately, the Austronesian language family, which eventually spread an extraordinary distance from Madagascar off the coast of Africa to Hawaii and Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, appears to trace its ultimate origin back to populations along the southeastern coast of China, in the broader region connected to the ancient Yangtze River lineage. Neither of these linguistic conclusions was originally built using genetic evidence, and they were built independently, decades earlier, using comparative analysis of vocabulary and grammar across living and historical languages. The fact that the genetic record, recovered only recently through ancient DNA, lines up so closely with conclusions linguists had already reached through a completely separate method is exactly the kind of independent confirmation that gives researchers real confidence in the overall picture. Two ancient population centers, one along each river, each eventually sending its descendants and its language outward across enormous distances, carried not by myth or migration legend, but by real, traceable populations of real people. This convergence between linguistics and genetics also quietly resolves something that puzzled scholars for a long time. How could populations as far apart as Madagascar and Easter Island end up speaking related languages, separated by literally half the circumference of the planet, with no obvious land connection between them? The genetic evidence answers that question directly. Descendants of the ancient Yangtze River population became skilled seafarers, gradually expanding outward across island Southeast Asia, and eventually across the open Pacific over a period of several thousand years, carrying their language, their agricultural knowledge, and their genetic ancestry with them at every step, eventually reaching islands separated from their original homeland by tens of thousands of kilometers of open ocean. So when you put all of this together, the actual answer to where Chinese civilization came from turns out to be both less exotic and significantly more impressive than the old migration theory ever proposed. There was no migrating population arriving from Mesopotamia to seed civilization along the Yellow River. The genetic record shows no such migration occurred, at the population level, at anywhere near the scale that theory required. What actually happened was that two separate, deeply indigenous populations, one centered on millet farming along the Yellow River, and one centered on rice farming along the Yangtze, independently developed agriculture, organized settlements, and eventually complex writing and metallurgy, gradually blending into one another over thousands of years to produce the population and the civilization that exists in China today. The only ancient civilization that genuinely matches the deep genetic ancestry of modern Chinese populations is, in the most literal sense possible, ancient China itself, the prehistoric farming societies that lived along those two rivers 9,000 years before anyone had written the first word of recorded Chinese history. That conclusion does not make the story smaller. If anything, it makes it considerably larger. It means that one of the most enduring, continuous cultural and genetic lineages on the planet developed almost entirely on its own terms, shaped by two great river systems rather than a single migrating founder population, blending gradually over an almost unimaginable span of time into the genetic and cultural identity that exists today. No borrowed origin story required. No distant founding population needed to explain how something this sophisticated came to exist. Just an extraordinarily long, continuous, locally rooted history, written not in cuneiform borrowed from somewhere else, but in the DNA of the people who never actually left. There's also a genuinely useful, practical dimension to this research that goes beyond settling old academic arguments. Understanding the real, dual river ancestry of modern Chinese populations has meaningful applications in medical genetics, because health-related genetic variants are not evenly distributed across a population assumed to be uniform. Researchers studying disease risk and drug response across different regions of China have found that the relative proportions of ancient Yellow River versus ancient Yangtze ancestry can meaningfully affect the frequency of certain genetic variants relevant to medicine in ways that a simplified, single-origin model of Chinese ancestry would completely miss. Treating more than 1 billion people as though they descend from one undifferentiated ancestral population, rather than from two deeply rooted and only gradually blended lineages, risks overlooking genuine regional variation that matters for accurate medical research and treatment. It is worth pausing here, too, on just how unusual it is for a research question this specific, the deep ancestral origin of one of the world's largest and oldest continuous civilizations, to get a clear, evidence-based answer at all. Most questions about ancient population history remain genuinely uncertain, limited by how much ancient DNA happens to survive in the archaeological record and how many sites have actually been excavated and sequenced. China's case turned out differently, in part because of the sheer number of ancient burial sites available for study across both river systems, and in part because the question had already been narrowed down so precisely by more than a century of prior archaeological and linguistic groundwork. By the time geneticists got involved, they were not starting from scratch. They were testing a specific, well-defined hypothesis, the foreign migration theory, all against an equally specific, well-defined alternative, deep local continuity, and the evidence came back decisively in favor of the latter. It also offers a useful lesson about how easily a plausible-sounding theory, built on a handful of surface-level similarities, can take hold in serious academic circles for decades before the right kind of evidence finally arrives to test it properly. For more than a century, some of the brightest minds in linguistics and archaeology genuinely believed that Chinese civilization had migrated in from the West, based on resemblances in writing systems that turned out to be coincidental rather than ancestral. It took the painstaking work of archaeologists, mapping out an unbroken sequence of local cultural development, followed eventually by geneticists extracting and sequencing DNA directly from ancient human remains, to finally settle a debate that speculation alone had kept alive for generations. The truth, once it arrived, was not a confirmation of an exciting migration story. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. An entire civilization that grew, almost entirely, out of its own soil. There's one more angle to this that's worth addressing directly, because it cuts against a certain instinct people have when a tidy, century-old theory turns out to be wrong, the assumption that something must have been hidden or suppressed, that mainstream historians somehow knew the migration theory was false all along and quietly buried it. The real story is far less dramatic and, honestly, far more representative of how science actually works. The original migration theory was proposed in good faith, based on the best comparative evidence available at the time, decades before anyone had the tools to recover and sequence DNA from ancient human remains. As archaeological excavation expanded throughout the 20th century, and as the technology to extract and analyze ancient genetic material matured only within the last 15 to 20 years, each new layer of evidence simply built on top of the last, gradually narrowing the range of plausible explanations until only one was left standing. Nobody suppressed an inconvenient truth. A century of patient, incremental archaeological and genetic research slowly closed in on an answer that earlier scholars, working with the tools available to them at the time, simply had no way to access. That incremental, evidence-driven process is, in its own way, the most reassuring part of this entire story. It means the conclusion we have today is not the product of a single dramatic discovery that could just as easily be overturned by the next one. It is the product of multiple independent lines of evidence, archaeology, comparative linguistics, and now ancient genomics, all converging on the same picture from completely different directions. When that many independent methods agree, the resulting answer tends to hold up. And in this case, the answer is about as settled as questions of deep ancient population history ever get. The people of the Yellow River and the people of the Yangtze River built their own civilization, almost entirely on their own terms, and the rest of the world had nothing to do with how it began. So the next time you come across a confident claim online insisting that some ancient civilization secretly seeded another one on the opposite side of the world, remember how this particular case actually got resolved. Not through speculation, not through visual pattern matching between unrelated symbols, but through the patient, decades-long accumulation of physical evidence, dug up one excavation at a time, sequenced one genome at a time, until the truth was simply too well supported to argue with anymore.